She arrived with nothing but a worn satchel and a look in her eyes that said she'd already survived worse than anything Montana could throw at her. Black Hollow Ranch hadn't seen a woman walk through that gate in 3 years, and the last one left in tears. Now here stood Alara Voss, 26 years old, half frozen, and refusing to flinch while 7 ranch hands stared at her like she was a bad joke someone had dragged in from the storm. They thought she'd be gone by morning. They were wrong. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, stay with me until the end of this story. Like this video and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled.
Yeah.
The storm had been building since noon. By the time Alara Voss reached the gate of Black Hollow Ranch, the wind was the kind that didn't just cut. It found the spaces between your bones and settled there. She'd been walking the last 4 miles because the wagon driver she'd paid $2 to carry her out from Mill Haven had stopped at the fork in the road, looked at the sky, and told her flatly that no amount of money was worth dying over. She hadn't argued. She picked up her satchel, pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, a man's coat too large, bought secondhand from a general store in Billings 6 weeks ago, and walked. The ranch materialized out of the white, like something that wasn't entirely sure it wanted to be found. A main house, dark and heavy timbered. A long bunkhouse with smoke leaking from one chimney. 3 outbuildings and a stable that looked older than the territory itself. And between all of it, the cookhouse, squat, low-roofed, with a stovepipe that wasn't producing any smoke at all. Alara noted that, filed it away. She pushed open the gate. The hinges screamed. Inside the main yard, a man was trying to split firewood in the storm, which told her more about the mood of this place than anything else could. He was broad through the shoulders, maybe 40, with a beard that had gone mostly gray and hands that looked like they'd been used for everything except gentle work. He stopped mid-swing when he saw her. He didn't say anything, just stared. "I'm looking for whoever does the hiring," Alara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man set the axe head down in the snow and leaned on the handle. "That'd be Griff Hartley, foreman." He looked her over the way people looked at something they expected to be less than what they were seeing. "What kind of work you looking for?" "Cook." A slow blink. "We don't got a cook." "I know. That's why I'm here." He studied her another moment, then jerked his chin toward the bunkhouse. "Griff's inside." She walked toward it. Behind her, she heard him mutter something under his breath. She couldn't catch all of it, only the last word, which was trouble. She kept walking. The bunkhouse hit her with warmth and the smell of men who'd been working hard in wet wool. 6 of them inside. Cards on a table, boots drying near the stove, someone's bridle hanging from a nail that had no business being in the wall, but had been there long enough that nobody questioned it anymore. They all looked up when she came in. The silence had a particular texture. Not surprise, exactly. More like the collective pause of people deciding how to react before they'd actually processed what they were reacting to. "I need to speak with Griff Hartley," Alara said. "You got him." The man who spoke was sitting closest to the stove, a tin cup balanced on his knee. He was lean in the way that came from hard work rather than shortage of food, with sharp eyes set in a face that had been weathered into something like leather. He looked at her the way the foreman of every outfit she'd ever encountered looked at anyone who walked in uninvited, measuring how much of a headache this was going to be. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "Alara Voss. I cook." She didn't waste words on it. "You don't have anyone in your cookhouse, and your men have been eating bad food since at least November, if the look of them is anything to go by." Someone at the card table made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite an insult. "The look of us," Griff repeated. "No disrespect meant, but I've been riding freight wagons through 4 counties, and I know what men look like when they've been eating from a can for 2 months straight." She set her satchel down on the floor, which was a small act of confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'm good at what I do, better than good. You give me 3 days and I'll prove it. After that, you decide whether I stay." Griff looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the kind that gave nothing away. Not contempt, not consideration, just a blankness that she'd learned to distrust in men because it usually meant they were deciding something before they said anything. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Most recently, Billings. Before that?" "Doesn't matter." The silence changed slightly. One of the card players, a young one, probably not yet 20, with a patchy attempt at a mustache, said something to the man beside him too quietly to hear, but the other one snorted. Here's the thing, Griff said. We had a cook. Name was Pete Mulroy. He was bad at it, but he was reliable, and he didn't cause problems. He left 3 weeks ago because his mother took sick. I've been meaning to put word out. He paused. But I wasn't exactly planning on something like this turning up at the gate in a blizzard. I understand that, Ilara said, but I'm here and the storm's not letting up, so let me make supper tonight. Whatever you've got in the dry stores, you eat it, and then you tell me whether you want me gone. Another pause. Long enough that she became aware of the wind against the bunkhouse walls, the creak of the building settling, someone's cards being set face down on the table. The cookhouse hasn't been run properly since October, Griff said finally. Stove needs work. Half the supplies are picked over. It's a mess in there. I've worked in worse. He looked at her steadily. You got nowhere else to go, is that it? The question landed the way it was meant to. Not cruel exactly. Griff Hartley didn't seem like a cruel man, more like a practical one, but direct enough to sting. She held his gaze. I've got skills, she said. That's what matters. I was quiet for one more moment. Then he stood up, set his cup down on the shelf beside the stove, and crossed to the door. He opened it, letting in a rush of cold and white. Cookhouse is the building with the dead stovepipe, he said. You've got until dark to get that stove running and have something on the table. If it's edible, you can sleep in the storeroom tonight, and we'll talk in the morning. He looked at her one more time. If it's not, I'll give you dry clothes and a bedroll, and first light tomorrow you find somewhere else. That's fair, Ilara said. She picked up her satchel and walked back out into the storm. Well, the cookhouse was worse than she'd prepared herself for. The stoves, an old Monarch range, iron, heavy, probably older than anyone currently working the ranch, had a cracked firebox door and what looked like a season's worth of accumulated ash and grease inside it. One of the windows had been patched with oilcloth that was now coming loose, letting in a finger of wind cold enough to make her breath visible. The work table was scattered with things that had no business being in a kitchen. A broken bridle strap, 3 horseshoe nails, an empty tobacco tin. A sack of dried beans had been left open, and half the contents had spilled across the floor. She stood in the middle of it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she set her satchel on the cleanest corner of the work table and got to work. The first thing was the stove. She opened the firebox, looked at the crack in the door, manageable, not structural, and started clearing the ash with a shovel she found leaning against the back wall. The cracked door would let some heat escape, but it would still burn. She'd deal with the crack later. Kindling was in a box near the door, wet on the top layer from the leaking window, but dry enough underneath. She built the fire carefully, the way she'd been taught, not in a hurry, but with attention. Small pieces first, then larger, letting each layer catch before adding the next. When the first real flame took hold, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She hadn't realized how cold she'd gotten until the warmth started to reach her. While the stove came up to heat, she inventoried the stores. The dry goods were depleted but not empty. Salt pork in a barrel, heavily packed. She'd need to soak it, but there was enough. Dried beans. A sack of cornmeal that had gone partially hard but could be broken up. A crock of lard. Flour with weevils in the top third, which she scooped off and discarded. Dried apple rings. Onions in a crate, half of them soft, but the firm ones were usable. A small amount of coffee, which was probably the most important thing on the ranch, and she treated it accordingly. She checked the root cellar through the trapdoor in the corner. More onions. A sack of potatoes. Some of them sprouted, but most of them sound. And in the back corner, behind an empty crate, 3 glass jars of something put up in summer. She held one to the light from the stovepipe opening and saw what looked like tomatoes. Someone had cared about this kitchen once, she thought. Whoever put up those tomatoes had known what they were doing. She took 2 jars upstairs and got to work. She made a pot of beans. She didn't have the soaking time she would have wanted, but she boiled them hard and added the salt pork and onion and let it go as long as she could. Cornbread from the hard cornmeal, mixed with the lard and water and cooked in 2 skillets directly on the stovetop because the oven door's hinges needed attention and she didn't trust them yet. The tomatoes went into the bean pot with a piece of dried chili she found in a tin in the back of a shelf. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't what she could do under better circumstances. But when she lifted the lid of the bean pot and tasted it, really tasted it, the way you had to if you were cooking for people who needed to eat, and not just people who needed to be filled up, She thought it was honest. It had body and heat and something that wasn't purely salt. She put the coffee on. The ranch hands came in ones and twos as the darkness settled fully and the storm peaked. They came through the door and stopped the same way the man in the yard had stopped, that half second of recalculation when something wasn't what you expected. But the cookhouse was warm now, the windows clearing of frost from the inside heat, and the smell had changed the quality of the air in a way that was impossible to ignore. The young one with the patchy mustache, she'd find out later his name was Cody, that he was 18, and from Nebraska, and that this was his first winter in Montana, sat down at the far end of the bench and looked at the pot like he was trying to figure out whether hope was appropriate. "Beans," he said. "And salt pork," Elara said. "Cornbread's in the skillet. Don't burn yourself." He served himself with a carefulness that suggested he was hungrier than he was willing to let on. She watched him take the first bite, watched the small shift in his expression. He didn't say anything, just kept eating. The others filed in. 7 in total, she counted them, and she kept quiet while they served themselves, which was harder than it sounded because she'd learned that silence in situations like this was a form of respect, and that the men who were most likely to accept her were the ones who were allowed to come to their own conclusions without being pushed. Griff came in last, sat at the head of the table, served himself without comment. Elara stood by the stove and waited. I was about 3/4 through his bowl before she noticed the one she hadn't accounted for. He'd come in with the others. She'd counted 7, but she'd been focused on the stove, and she'd miscounted or missed him coming through the door. He was sitting at the middle of the bench, which was neither close to the head of the table where Griff sat, nor at the end with Cody and the others. He was eating steadily, not quickly, and he wasn't talking to anyone, which wasn't unusual in and of itself, but something about him was different from the others in a way she couldn't immediately name. I was maybe 30, or close to it. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that was currently obscured by several days of beard. He was built lean and rangy, the kind of build that looked unremarkable, until you noticed the quality of stillness he carried. Not laziness, not tiredness, but something more deliberate. Like a man who had trained himself not to take up more space than necessary. When he looked up and found her watching him, he didn't look away the way most people did when they were caught. He just looked back. She moved her eyes back to the stove. The meal ended, Griff set down his spoon. "Where'd you learn?" he said. "My mother," Elara said, "and then wherever I worked." Which was where? A cattle outfit in Wyoming, a boarding house in Denver, a hotel kitchen in Cheyenne before it closed. She kept her voice even. Other places. Griff nodded slowly. "The beans needed more time." "I know that. I had 40 minutes. The cornbread was good. The cornmeal was partly spoiled. I need fresh supplies." Something shifted slightly in his expression, the faintest hint of something she might have called appreciation if she'd been more optimistic. "I'll see what we've got in the house stores," he said. "There may be more. The stovepipe needs cleaning. The oven hinges are gone. I need lard, more flour, and whatever you have by way of dried meat if the salt pork runs low." Cody, at the end of the table, was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before, that specific look young men got when something had happened that they weren't entirely sure how to categorize. Like the world had briefly behaved differently than they'd expected. The man at the middle of the bench was still watching her, not intrusively, not in the way some men watched women in unfamiliar spaces. Something quieter than that. More like he was paying attention. "You can use the storeroom," Griff said. "There's a cot in there from when Pete was sick one winter. I'll have someone bring firewood for the night." He stood. "We'll talk terms in the morning." The others filtered out into the cold. She cleared the table, washed the bowls in the water she'd kept warm on the stove's back burner, and tried not to notice how much her hands were shaking. Not from cold now, but from something closer to relief, which was a feeling she'd learned not to trust too quickly. She was drying the last bowl when she heard the door. She turned. It was him, the man from the middle of the bench. He was carrying an armful of firewood, which he set down beside the stove without being asked. "Griff said someone would bring it," Elara said. "I know." He stood there a moment, looking at the stove. "The crack in the firebox door. You can pack it with clay from the riverbank when the ground thaws enough. Seals it for a season." She looked at him. "I know that. Figured you might." He turned to go. "What's your name?" she asked. He paused at the door. For just a moment, long enough for her to notice. "Sawyer," he said. He went out, and she heard his boots on the frozen ground heading away toward the bunkhouse, and then nothing but the wind and the settling of the fire inside the stove. She stood there for a moment. Sawyer. She didn't know why it landed in her the way it did, like a word in a language she'd half forgotten, like a name she'd almost known once and had been trying not to remember. She pushed it away. She was tired. She was cold still, in the deep parts of herself that a stove couldn't reach in one night. She had a cot in a storeroom and work tomorrow, and that was what mattered. She banked the stove for the night and went to find the cot. She woke twice before dawn. The first time was nothing. The storeroom settling, the wind changing direction. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then let herself sink back under. The second time was a dream, and she came up out of it the way she'd come up out of cold water before, gasping, heart going hard, hands gripping the blanket before she was fully awake. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see and waited for her breathing to slow. The dream was always some variation of the same things. A man's voice, a door she couldn't open, the particular quality of being somewhere she had worked for something and having it taken from her before she could hold it. She'd had versions of that dream for 3 years. She'd gotten better at the waking up part, at going from underwater to standing on solid ground faster than she used to. But she hadn't gotten rid of it. "You don't belong here." The voice in the dream was never specific. It was assembled from pieces of different people, different moments, but the meaning was always the same. She sat up in the dark storeroom of the cookhouse at Black Hollow Ranch, surrounded by sacks of dried beans and the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of the storm finally breaking apart outside, and she said very quietly, to no one, "I'm still here." She got up and started the stove before the sky had begun to lighten, so that when the first man came to the door of the cookhouse for coffee at 5:30, what he found was heat and light and something cooking, and Alara Voss standing at the work table with her sleeves rolled up, already an hour into the work she'd claimed. The days that followed were not easy, but Alara had not come to Black Hollow expecting easy. She established her rhythm in the cookhouse the way you established any kind of foothold, methodically, without drawing too much attention to what you were doing, paying close attention to what the place needed and what the people needed and where those two things were different. The cookhouse itself needed structural attention she couldn't provide, and a full restocking she was slowly negotiating with Griff, who approved her supply requests with the carefully measured reluctance of a man who had been approving expenses for 20 years and had developed opinions about what things should cost. She worked with what she had. What the people needed was more complicated. There were 8 ranch hands in total during the deep winter, with 2 more expected when the spring hiring began. She cataloged them the way she always cataloged the people she cooked for, not with any particular warmth at first, because warmth got ahead of itself and made mistakes, but with attention. What they ate fast and what they picked at, who came in already angry and who came in quiet, who made jokes that were actually jokes and who made jokes that were something else. Cody, the youngest, was homesick in the specific way that young men who refused to admit homesickness were homesick. He ate everything she put in front of him and never complained. And twice she caught him sitting outside the cookhouse in weather that no sane person sat outside involuntarily, just being near the smell of food cooking. She started making extra cornbread. A man named Dutch, 40-something, big, from somewhere originally German to judge by the occasional word that slipped out when he was tired, was the one who'd said something under his breath when she'd walked in that first day. He didn't apologize, he didn't soften, but he also came back every meal, and he ate, and that was its own kind of statement. There was a pair who rode and worked together so consistently that everyone seemed to refer to them as a unit, Barker and Webb. Barker was the talker. Webb was the one who watched whatever room he was in with the calm assessment of a man who had learned that the best time to understand a situation was before it became critical. And then there was Sawyer. She didn't learn much about Sawyer in those first days beyond the basic logistics of his presence. He was up before the others, came to coffee first, worked longer hours than anyone except possibly Griff, and kept to himself in a way that wasn't unfriendly exactly, but was definitely deliberate. He helped with practical things without making a production of it. The second morning she found that the stovepipe had been cleared while she was still asleep. The loose window oilcloth was nailed back down properly. A broken shelf bracket in the storeroom had been replaced with a piece of scrap wood that was plain but solid. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. She noticed he never sat at the far end of the bench with the younger hands, and never at the head near Griff's end. Always the middle, always slightly apart. She noticed he watched her work sometimes, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, not in the particular way she'd learned to be watchful for over the years. More like the way Webb watched a room, like he was trying to understand something and was willing to take his time about it. She did not think about the name that had landed oddly in her the night she arrived. She had enough to do. By the end of the first week, the meals were better than they'd been at any point Griff could apparently remember. This was not pure skill on Alara's part, though the skill was real, but also the result of a full inventory of what the ranch actually had versus what Griff thought it had, a negotiated supply run to Mill Haven that got her fresh flour, lard, dried fruit, and several pounds of smoked beef, and the discovery of a garden plot behind the cookhouse that someone had abandoned after a modest harvest in September, which still had a few frost-hardened vegetables she could work with. She made biscuits that didn't taste like sawdust. She made a beef and potato stew that had depth and heat. On the Sunday of that first week, she made a dried apple pie with the last of the apple rings, and the cookhouse went quieter than she'd heard it when she set it on the table. The particular quiet of men who were trying not to look like they cared about something they very clearly cared about. Cody said, "Is that—" and stopped. "Pie," Alara confirmed. "Where'd the apples—" "Stores." He ate 2 pieces and didn't say another word during supper, and when she was cleaning up afterward, she found that someone had stacked the dirty bowls neatly beside the wash basin, which had not happened unprompted before. The respect, though. The respect was a slower process, and she'd known it would be. There was an ongoing low-level skepticism from several of the hands that she understood was not about her competence specifically, but about the disruption she represented. A woman in a space they'd all agreed implicitly was not a woman's space. Some of them would get over it when they got over it. Some of them might never get over it, and she'd work around them. The one who occupied the most of her attention was a man named Rue Callahan. Callahan was 35 maybe, and had been on the ranch for 4 years, long enough to feel proprietary about it in a way that didn't have anything to do with the work itself. He was the kind of man who filled a room not because he was physically large, but because he was loud, and because he'd figured out early that if you said things with enough certainty, people often didn't push back. He hadn't said anything directly offensive to Alara in that first week, but he talked around her in ways she recognized. The jokes directed at the other men that were obviously about her. The small tests, the performance of ignoring her that was itself a form of attention. She didn't feed it. She cooked the meals and did the work and kept her eyes on what she was doing. One morning, she was hauling water from the pump to the cookhouse. The pump was across the yard, which meant 3 trips with the heavy bucket, which was not ideal in any weather and was genuinely punishing in a Montana winter. When Callahan came out of the stable and watched her struggle with the ice on the path. "You need help?" he said. "I've got it," she said. "Looks like you don't." She set the bucket down, straightened, and looked at him. "I've got it," she said again, evenly. He watched her for a moment with the expression of a man who was deciding whether to press something. Then he shrugged and went back inside the stable. She picked up the bucket and kept going. That evening, she asked Griff about getting a second bucket and a length of rope so she could rig a simple carry system between the pump and the cookhouse. He looked at her like she'd said something mildly strange, and then told her there was a spare bucket in the equipment shed and she could use whatever rope she needed. She set it up herself the next morning. It wasn't elegant, but it halved her hauling time. Nobody commented on it. The evening of the 9th day, she was at the work table making dough for the next morning's biscuits when she heard the door and didn't look up. "Coffee's on the back burner," she said. "I know." Sawyer's voice. She'd started to be able to identify them by their sound on the step. Cody was light and quick. Dutch was heavy. Callahan dragged one boot slightly. Sawyer moved quietly for his size and stopped before he was fully through the door, which was a habit that struck her as something learned rather than natural. She heard him pour a cup, but he didn't leave. She could feel him standing somewhere near the stove. "Griff said you grew up cooking," he said. She worked the dough. "My mother cooked. I helped her." "Where?" "Nebraska originally. Then we moved." "Where'd you move?" She looked up then. He was standing with the cup in both hands, looking at the stove rather than at her, which she found odd. The others, when they talked to her, looked at her. He seemed to make a practice of not doing that, of finding something else to look at. and she'd been trying to figure out whether it was a form of consideration or something else. South, she said, then west. We moved a lot. She looked back down at the dough. Why? A pause, long enough to notice. No reason, he said, just asking. He finished the coffee and set the cup in the basin and went out. She stood at the work table for a moment after the door closed, her hands still in the dough, and tried to identify what felt odd about the exchange. He'd been asking questions, which none of the others did. But it hadn't felt like nosiness. It had felt like something more careful than that, like a man circling something from a distance he'd decided on for reasons of his own. She didn't know why that bothered her, or why it stayed with her for the rest of the evening while she finished the dough and banked the stove and went to the storeroom to sleep. She lay on the cot in the dark and listened to the wind, which had dropped to something almost gentle after the fury of that first week, and thought about nothing in particular, and eventually she slept. Outside in the deep cold of the Montana night, Black Hollow Ranch held its breath against the winter, and the snow kept falling, steady and indifferent, covering everything equally. The good and the bad, the earned and the borrowed, the things that had been decided, and the things that were still waiting to become what they were going to be. The cookhouse stovepipe sent its smoke up into the dark. The light in the storeroom window went out, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, a man who had not said what he knew sat awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling and carrying something he had not yet decided what to do with. The snow from that first brutal week never fully left. It compacted into a hard gray crust across the yard, and new snow fell on top of it every few days. Not the dramatic, suffocating kind of the storm that had brought Ilara to the gate, but the steady, patient kind that accumulated without announcement and made everything slightly more difficult than it had been the day before. Montana winter in its middle stage, the kind that wore people down not by force, but by duration. Ilara had been at Black Hollow for 2 weeks when Griff told her, without ceremony, that she was on until spring. He said it the way he said most things, standing in the cookhouse doorway in the morning, half his attention still on whatever was happening in the yard behind him, delivering the information like he was reading it off a list. "You're staying until spring. We'll work out wages. Come find me this afternoon." Then he left. She stood at the stove and looked at the door he'd just walked out of and felt something in her chest that she didn't immediately name. It wasn't quite relief, and it wasn't quite happiness. It was something closer to the particular sensation of putting weight onto a floor you weren't sure would hold you, and finding that it did. She went back to the biscuits. The wages Griff offered were fair, which surprised her more than it probably should have. She'd been paid less for harder work before, and she'd been paid the same for work that was clearly valued less. Griff set out the number without negotiation. It was a statement, not an opening bid, and she accepted it, and they shook hands across the kitchen table like two people finishing a business transaction, which is exactly what it was. "One thing," Griff said, still standing. "The men. I need there to be no problems." "I haven't caused any." "I know that." He looked at her steadily. "I mean, if problems come to you, you come to me first. Don't handle it on your own." She looked at him. "And if I can handle it on my own?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not enough to be called that. "Then I suppose you do." He put his hat on. "Just don't make a mess I have to clean up." "I'll do my best," she said. He nodded and went out. The meals had been transforming the ranch in a way that nobody talked about directly, but that Ilara could feel in the texture of the evenings. The cookhouse had become a place men moved toward at the end of the day, rather than a place they moved toward because they had to eat. It was a small distinction, but it wasn't a nothing one. When food was merely fuel, which it had apparently been under the previous arrangement, a rotation of badly cooked salt pork and hardtack variations. People ate as quickly as possible and left. When food was something else, something that had attention and care in it, people sat longer. They didn't always talk more. Sometimes they just sat. Cody had started helping her clear the table without being asked, which she noticed but didn't comment on because commenting would embarrass him. He was at the age where he needed to feel like generosity was his own idea. She let him have that. Dutch, who had been the most openly dismissive in that first week, had shifted into something she could only describe as grudging neutrality. He ate everything she cooked, never complimented it, but had twice brought her things without explanation. Once a better knife from somewhere in the equipment shed, left on the work table without comment, and once a handful of dried sage from wherever he'd been storing it, set beside the stove. She used the sage. She kept the knife. Barker had appointed himself the informal newsbringer of the cookhouse, arriving at meals with some piece of information about what was happening on the ranch or in the nearest town, offered to the table at large with the cheerful proprietary air of a man who believed information was currency. He was harmless and occasionally useful, and she tolerated his habit of talking while she was clearly in the middle of something with more patience than she might have a year earlier. Webb stayed quiet and watched, and she had decided she liked Webb precisely because of it. And Callahan. Callahan was still a problem she was managing rather than one she'd solved. The difficulty with Callahan was that nothing he did was clear enough to confront directly. He was too practiced for that. It was the small things, the commentary aimed sideways at the other men that she was meant to overhear, the specific way he said her name when he was speaking to someone else that had a particular quality of dismissal in it. The morning he came into the cookhouse while she was working and stood in the middle of the room for a long moment without saying anything, just standing there, taking up space in a way she understood was deliberate, until she looked up. "Something you need?" she'd said. "Just getting coffee." The coffee was behind him. He knew where it was. He poured it and left, but the room felt different for 10 minutes after he'd gone, the way a room feels different when something's been moved slightly out of place. She told herself she was managing it. She was. But managing something was not the same as it being managed. It was in the third week that she started to really notice the nature of Sawyer's particular attention. It wasn't constant. That was what made it harder to categorize than it might otherwise have been. He didn't follow her with his eyes the way Callahan did in his own way. Callahan's watching was territorial, a form of pressure. Sawyer's was different. It was intermittent and apparently involuntary, like a man who kept finding his attention pulled somewhere it hadn't been pointing. He still came in early for coffee. He still sometimes stayed a little after the others had gone. The practical help with the cookhouse had continued, things getting fixed or improved in the early hours before she was up, without announcement. The broken oven hinge, a gap in the storeroom wall that had been letting in cold. The third step on the cookhouse entrance, which had been rotting and now was solid board. One morning she came in and found a proper clay pack on the firebox door crack. Smooth, carefully applied, already dried. She ran her finger along it. He'd gotten the river clay while the ground was still frozen along the banks, which meant he'd worked to chip it out. It would hold until summer and needed replacing then, but it would hold. She made a pot of particularly good coffee that morning. She didn't say anything about it, but she made sure there was a cup ready when he came in at 5:30, already hot. He poured it, stood at the stove for a moment, said, "Clay took." "I saw," she said. He drank the coffee. She made biscuits. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was a comfortable quiet, which was the kind of quiet she'd learned not to trust and was finding herself trusting anyway. "Where were you before Wyoming?" he asked, one of those mornings. She kept cutting biscuit rounds. "Why are you asking me that?" "I'm curious." "About what specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. She'd noticed he didn't fill silence with noise the way most people did. He let it sit, and usually something more honest came out of it. "About how you ended up here," he said finally. "Same way most people end up anywhere. Things happened, and here's where they led." "Things," he repeated. "That's what I said." She heard him set his cup down. "You're careful about the past." "Most people are careful about something." She looked up. "What are you careful about?" He met her eyes and held them, and for a moment she had the peculiar sensation that she'd touched something real and slightly painful in him, the way you might press without thinking on a bruise you didn't know was there. "A few things," he said. She looked back down at the biscuits. "Then we understand each other." He picked up his cup again. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, one of the horses was making noise about something in the stable. "You're good at this," he said. "Not the cooking." She could tell from his tone he meant something broader. The managing of things. The holding of ground. "I've had practice," she said. "That's not a compliment to whoever gave you the practice." She laughed. A short, genuine sound that surprised her, because she hadn't been expecting to. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." He left a few minutes later. She stood at the work table and looked at the row of biscuit rounds she'd cut and tried to figure out what the laugh had meant. That it had come so suddenly, that it had felt so entirely unguarded. She didn't come to any conclusions she was prepared to accept. The afternoon of the 17th day Barker came in early and sat down at the table before supper and told her, in the comfortable way he had of sharing information that was none of his business, that the ranch's owner would be coming through sometime in late February. Who is the owner? She asked. It was the first time she'd thought to ask directly. She'd assumed Griff, and then assumed something more complicated than Griff. Man named Weston, Barker said. Marcus Weston. He's got 3 properties in the territory. This one, a spread up near the Blackfoot, and something down in Colorado. Doesn't come here much. Griff runs things. Has he been here recently? Not since last summer. He'll want to look at the books, check the herd numbers. Barker picked up a dried apple ring from the preparation plate on the table, and she didn't stop him because he'd told her something useful. He'll want to eat too, probably, so I guess that's good for you. Show your best. She thought about that. Is he a fair man? She asked. Barker considered it with the particular expression of a man who was weighing what he actually knew against what he'd decided to believe. He's not a bad man, he said finally. He's a businessman. It's not the same thing. She filed that away and went back to work. Set. That evening at supper, something shifted. It started as nothing, a meal like any other, the men coming in from the cold in ones and twos, the cookhouse filling with the sounds of boots and spurs, and the particular combination of exhaustion and hunger that defined the end of a ranch day. She'd made a proper beef stew with the last of the smoked beef. From the last supply run, potatoes, onion, a handful of dried herbs she'd been rationing because she wasn't sure when the next supply trip would happen. There was bread, real bread baked in the oven, whose hinge she'd finally gotten repaired. It was one of the better meals she'd managed since arriving. Everything was fine until Callahan sat down. He'd been out in the far pasture all day with Dutch, checking the fence line along the north boundary. Hard, miserable work in the cold. And he came in with the particular bad mood of a man who has been uncomfortable for 8 hours and wants somewhere to put it. She'd seen that mood walk through the door before. She knew how to read it. She kept her movement steady and kept her attention on the stove and let the meal speak for itself the way it usually did. Callahan helped himself to the stew. He ate part of it. Then he pushed the bowl slightly toward the center of the table in a gesture that was too deliberate to be unconscious and said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Getting a little thin on the meat there, Alara." The table didn't go quiet. It shifted, which was different. Some people kept eating. Some people found something to look at that wasn't Callahan or her. She turned from the stove. There's enough, she said. Last of the supply run. More coming Thursday. I'm just saying. He leaned back from the table slightly. A man works 10 hours in the cold. He wants to come into something that's got some substance to it. Then eat the bread. Her voice was level. She'd had this conversation in several different kitchens with several different versions of the same man, and she knew how to keep it from escalating. It'll fill you. What I'm saying is maybe you're not stretching the supplies right. The supplies are what they are, she said. I've made them last 2 weeks past what they should have. If you've got notes on the rationing, you're welcome to take them up with Griff. Callahan smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve anything above the mouth. See, that's the thing about you, he said. Can't take the smallest bit of feedback without getting your back up. I'm not getting my back up. I'm explaining how rationing works. Right. He looked around the table, making an audience of them, which she recognized as the actual purpose of this conversation. Boys, you want to back me up here? Little light on the meat tonight? Cody was looking at his bowl. Dutch was looking at the wall. Barker had stopped mid-chew and was watching with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere else. Webb, at the end of the bench, was watching Callahan with the steady patience of a man waiting for a thing to finish. Nobody said anything. I think it's fine, Cody said finally, quietly, to his bowl. Callahan looked at him for a moment, then back at Alara. Kid's being polite, he said. Don't read too much into it. She turned back to the stove. She was done engaging. Engaging further was what he wanted. The back and forth, the spectacle. She would not give it to him. He pushed the bowl back toward himself and picked up his spoon and said, to no one in particular, 3 weeks and she's already got the younger ones going soft. The table went properly quiet this time. She kept her back to the room. Her hand on the ladle was steady, and she was proud of that, how steady it was, though she was aware of something moving in her chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but was a compressed mixture of both that she'd learned to contain a long time ago. That's enough. The voice was quiet, not raised, but it had a quality of finality that cut through the room without effort. Sawyer had not spoken since sitting down to eat. He'd been at the middle of the bench the way he always was, eating steadily, and she hadn't been paying attention to him specifically because she'd been managing the other situation. But his voice, when it came, had a weight to it that the room felt. Callahan turned to look at him. "Something you want to say, Kane?" "I already said it." "You got a problem with honest feedback?" "I got a problem with what you're doing." Sawyer set his spoon down. He wasn't looking at Callahan the way men looked at each other when a fight was about to happen. Not with heat, not with aggression. With something steadier and in some ways more unsettling. "She's been running this kitchen for 3 weeks, and the food's better than it's been in 2 years. You know that. Everyone at this table knows that. So what you're doing isn't about the stew." The silence was of a particular density. Callahan's jaw moved. For a moment she thought he was going to say something that would cross a clear line, and she braced for it, already working out what came after. But he looked at Sawyer for a long moment, and then he looked away, and he picked up his bowl, and he ate. Nobody said anything for the rest of the meal. After the men had gone out, she washed the bowls with more force than was strictly necessary, the water sloshing and her hands working hard. She was not going to be shaken by Callahan. She had handled Callahan, and she would keep handling Callahan, and tonight was just one instance of an ongoing situation that she was managing. But her hands were not entirely steady, and she was aware of that. She heard the door. "You don't have to fight my battles," she said, without turning. "I know," Sawyer said. "I wasn't." He came in and leaned against the wall near the stove, which was where he usually stood when he stayed after the others had left. "I had a problem with what he was doing. That's different. It's going to make things harder tomorrow. He won't like being called out like that." "Maybe." "Not maybe. I know men like Callahan. They don't take humiliation well. I wasn't humiliated. He was told to stop. There's a difference." Sawyer looked at her. "Are you all right?" The question arrived simply, without performance, which made it harder to deflect than a more elaborate version of itself would have been. She set the bowl she was drying down on the work table and turned to look at him. "I've been through worse than Rue Callahan," she said. "I know." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you?" He held her gaze. That stillness he carried. It was present now in full, that quality of a man who had decided something and was waiting for the moment to become clear. "I'll get out of your way," he said. He pushed off from the wall. "Sawyer." He stopped. She didn't know exactly what she'd been going to say. She stood there at the work table in the warm cookhouse with the fire going and the smell of the evening's meal still in the air, and looked at this man who fixed things without explaining himself, and intervened without performing heroism, and looked at her with a kind of attention she couldn't quite put a name to. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said." He nodded once. Not a dismissal, an acknowledgement. Like her thanks had weight, and he was accepting it as such. "Good night, Ilara," he said. He went out. The door closed soft behind him. She stood in the cookhouse for a long moment, alone in the warmth, and thought about the particular way he'd said her name. Not in the pointed way Callahan used it, not in the easy way Cody or Barker did, but carefully, the way you said something you wanted to get right. She thought about the questions he'd been asking her, where she'd come from, how she'd ended up here. She thought about the way he sometimes paused before answering her, as if what he was about to say required more consideration than ordinary conversation warranted. She turned back to the basin, finished the washing, and told herself she was tired. That tiredness made everything mean more than it actually meant. That what she needed was the cot and sleep and another day of work tomorrow, and that was the whole of it. She banked the stove. She went to the storeroom. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the cold pressing against the walls and the fire inside the stove ticking down. And she thought, not for the first time but with a sharper edge than before, that there was something Sawyer Kane was not telling her. She couldn't have said what made her certain of it. Something in the quality of his questions, something in the way he watched her. Not like a man watching a stranger, but like a man watching someone he already knew and was trying to reconcile with something in his own memory. The pauses before he spoke. The things he said and the things he didn't. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know if she wanted to know. She fell asleep with the question unanswered, the way she'd learned to fall asleep with most things, by accepting that some things resolved themselves in their own time, and that trying to force them was its own kind of exhaustion. Outside, the snow kept falling. Callahan was different after that evening. Not softer. That wasn't the word for it, and she wouldn't have used it, but the quality of his hostility shifted from something openly performed to something that ran underground. And in some ways that was harder to manage because underground things were harder to see coming. He stopped making comments at the table. He stopped the sideways jokes aimed at the other men. He ate his meals, did his work, and treated her with a formality that was its own kind of statement. The exaggerated courtesy of a man who wanted everyone around him to understand that he was being very deliberate about not doing the thing he wanted to do. She watched it. She didn't relax. The other men seemed to relax, though, which she understood but didn't entirely share. Cody had taken Sawyer's intervention as some kind of resolution, a line drawn that would hold. Dutch seemed largely indifferent, as Dutch was largely indifferent to most things that didn't involve the immediate work in front of him. Barker had moved on to other topics within 24 hours, which was simply his nature. Even Webb, who watched things most carefully, seemed to settle back into his usual steady patience. Only Sawyer still watched Callahan with the same quality of attention he'd had before. She noticed that, filed it. The days were getting marginally longer, which in Montana in February meant almost nothing in terms of actual warmth, but meant something in terms of the feeling of things. The light lasted another 10 minutes, then another 15. The horses seemed to notice, the men seemed to notice. Even the cookhouse felt fractionally less like a shelter against extinction and slightly more like a place where you could pause and breathe. Elara was sleeping better. Not well. She didn't have a category for sleeping well, hadn't for years. But the worst of the waking twice a night was settling into a more manageable once, and sometimes not at all. She thought it was the work. Hard physical work did something to the mind that other things didn't. It pressed you flat at the end of the day and held you there until morning. She was making real food now, not just functional food, food with intention in it. She'd found that Griff, despite his economy with words and approval, had a weakness for anything made with dried chiles, and would eat a second helping without being asked if she used them. Cody couldn't abide anything with too much fat, and would push the meat pieces to the edge of his bowl in a way he clearly thought was subtle. Dutch ate everything but slowed down for bread, which meant bread was the thing she kept in constant supply. Webb drank more coffee than any human being probably should, and she made sure the pot was never empty. She knew them. Not deeply, not in the way you knew people after years, but in the way you knew people when you fed them every day, through the small preferences and habits and tells that food brought out of people more reliably than conversation ever did. Sawyer, she was still learning. He ate everything she made with the same attention he brought to everything else, steadily, without performance. She could tell when something was better than usual by a quality of pause he'd make partway through, a slight slowing, like he was paying a different kind of attention to what was in front of him. He never said so. She started cooking for that pause the way a musician played for the one person in the room who was actually listening. She told herself that was just professional pride, the desire to be seen doing good work. She mostly believed it. It was Barker who told her about the Cheyenne incident. It came out sideways, the way things with Barker usually did. He'd come in early, as he sometimes did when he had something to say, and wanted an audience that wouldn't immediately redistribute the information across the ranch. And he'd poured his coffee and sat down and started talking about something else entirely, and then drifted toward it the way water drifted toward a low place. "You ever hear of a place called the Carlton Boarding House down in Cheyenne?" he asked. She kept her hands on the bread dough she was working. "Why?" "No reason. Just Sawyer mentioned Cheyenne once a while back. Said he'd had work down there a few years ago." "Lots of people have worked in Cheyenne." "Sure." Barker drank his coffee, looked at the ceiling in the way he looked at things when he was deciding how much to say. "He doesn't talk about it much. The Cheyenne time. Most men who work down that way do. There was that whole business with the Franklin operation, the land dispute that went bad. A lot of men got caught in the middle of that one." She said nothing. She worked the dough. "You ever work in Cheyenne?" Barker asked. "I've worked a lot of places," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not particularly steady, but it was not showing. "Sure," Barker said again. He finished his coffee and stood up. "Good bread," he said, which was his way of saying he understood she was done with the conversation. He went out. She stood at the work table and pressed her palms flat into the dough and breathed. Cheyenne. The Carlton Boarding House. The Franklin operation and the land dispute and everything that had come before it and after it and inside it. She had not spoken those words aloud since she'd left. She had not spoken them in her head in anything louder than a whisper. She breathed until her hands were steady again. Then she kept working. That afternoon, she found Sawyer at the fence line on the east side of the property, doing a section of repair work alone, which was something she'd noticed he did. Took on tasks that could reasonably be shared and did them without company. She hadn't planned to come out here. She'd needed to check the root cellar behind the back of the main house for the last crate of potatoes, and the most direct route happened to go past the east fence, and she'd seen him out there from 50 yards away, and had made a decision she wasn't entirely sure about before she'd finished making it. She stopped a few feet from where he was working. He'd heard her coming. She could tell by the slight pause in his movement before she was in his line of sight, the way he'd placed her by sound before she arrived. "Barker mentioned Cheyenne," she said. He kept his hands on the fence rail for a moment. Then he set the wire stretcher down and turned to look at her. The cold was sharp out here away from the buildings, the kind that got into the face and ears immediately. His expression was careful. That was the word. Not guilty, not surprised, but careful in the way of a man who had been waiting for a specific conversation to arrive and had not yet decided how he was going to handle it. "What did he say?" Sawyer asked. "Not much. Just that you'd worked there. During the Franklin business." A pause. "Did you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. The cold pressed against both of them, and the ranch sounds were distant out here. Wind, a horse somewhere, the creak of the main fence post in the gusts. "Were you at the Carlton?" she asked. She kept her voice even. She needed her voice to stay even for this. Something moved in his expression, not a flinch exactly, but something that had the shape of one. "I wasn't inside," he said. "I was with the Franklin outfit. We were contracted to—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "We were part of the operation that forced the closure. I didn't know at the time what it meant for the people working there." He paused. "That's not an excuse. I'm telling you what I knew and when I knew it." The wind moved between them. "People lost everything in that closure," she said. Her voice was still even, which was costing her something she couldn't have named a price for. "The women who worked that kitchen, the ones who'd been there years, they didn't get paid out. It closed and they were gone." "I know that," he said quietly. "Did you know it then?" He didn't answer immediately. She understood from the silence that the answer was complicated, that he'd known something, maybe not everything, and that the question of what a person did with partial knowledge was a question he'd been carrying for a while. "Not the full of it," he said. "I knew it wasn't clean. I told myself it wasn't my piece of it." He looked at her directly. "I've thought about that a fair amount since." "You recognized me," she said. Not a question. "When you walked in the gate," he said. "The first day." She absorbed that. A month of him knowing something she hadn't known he knew. All the early mornings, and the coffee, and the questions about where she'd been, and the watching that she'd thought was something, and now understood was something else layered on top of it. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "I didn't know what to say." He picked up the wire stretcher and set it down again, which was the closest thing to a nervous gesture she'd seen him make. "I thought if I told you right away, you'd go. You'd think I was the reason you were in a bad spot and you'd leave before you'd had a chance to—" He stopped. "I wanted you to have a fair chance here, on your own terms, before any of that mattered." She stood with that for a moment. "And now?" she said. "Now it matters," he said, "and I'm telling you." The wind gusted and she pulled her coat tighter, the oversized man's coat that had gotten her this far. She looked out at the flat white of the fields and the dark line of the tree break to the north and the heavy gray sky that had been promising snow since morning. She was angry. She was aware of being angry in the specific layered way of someone who had several valid reasons for the anger and was having trouble deciding which one was the most legitimate. He should have told her. The fact that he'd recognized her and said nothing for a month was a thing she couldn't entirely absorb yet. But she was also aware, and this was the harder, more uncomfortable awareness, that what he'd just said about wanting her to have a fair chance was probably true, and that she didn't know what to do with true things that arrived alongside things she had the right to be angry about. "I cooked in that kitchen for 2 years, she said finally. "It was the best job I'd had. I was good at it, and they knew I was good at it, and it mattered." She paused. "When it closed, I had $40 and a bag of clothes and nowhere to go." "I know," he said, "or I know the shape of it. I didn't know it was you specifically then." "Would it have mattered if you'd known it was me specifically?" The question sat between them. He looked at her with that stillness of his, the kind that was starting to feel less like distance and more like the particular quality of a person who didn't say things they didn't mean. Yes, he said, it would have mattered. She didn't know what to do with that either. She turned and walked back toward the cookhouse, and he let her go, which was the right thing to do, and she was obscurely grateful for it. She worked through supper preparation with a focus that was partly professional and partly the particular kind of concentration that kept you from having to feel what you were feeling. She made a good meal, pork and potato hash with the dried chiles she'd been rationing, bread, the last of the dried apple pie, filling stretched into small tarts she'd been saving the technique for. Her hands moved without her having to direct them. That was what years of this work gave you. Your hands knew things your head didn't have to manage. The men came in. The meal was eaten. The sounds were the usual sounds. Callahan sat at his end of the bench and ate without comment. Sawyer sat in the middle and ate without looking at her more than once. She caught it, that once, and looked away first, which was not something she usually did. Cody said the tarts were the best thing he'd ever eaten, which was an exaggeration but a sincere one, and she thanked him and meant it. After the others had cleared out, she was at the basin when she heard a sound that registered wrong before she'd consciously processed it. A footstep on the cookhouse floor when she'd thought the room was empty, heavier than it should have been, from a direction that wasn't the door. She turned. Callahan was standing between her and the door. He'd stayed behind. She hadn't seen him stay behind. He'd been near the back of the room, near the storeroom door, and she'd been at the basin with her back to the room, which was a mistake she was going to think about for a long time. Good meal tonight, he said. She set the bowl she was holding down slowly. Thanks, she said. I'm cleaning up. I know. He didn't move. I wanted to talk to you. Talk then. What I said the other night, about the meat being thin. It's been handled. By Kane, you mean. His voice had an edge that was new. Not the performed sarcasm of before, but something rawer. That's what bothers me. You've got him fighting your corner. He said his piece. That's his business. Is it? Callahan took one step forward, and she took one step back before she'd decided to, which put the work table behind her. Funny how that works. Man like that, no authority on this ranch, suddenly he's got opinions about how I speak to the cook. Then take it up with Sawyer, she said. Her voice was level. She was working hard for that levelness. I'm taking it up with you. Another step. You've been here a month and you've got the young ones thinking you're something special, and you've got Kane acting like he's your— Stop right there, she said. He didn't stop. He covered the last 2 feet between them and grabbed her arm above the elbow. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to hold. And the contact went through her like cold water, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Because she knew what it meant. She had always known what this specific moment felt like when it arrived. The moment where the managed situation became something that was no longer managed. The fear was old. It came back the way old things did. Completely, with no regard for how much time had passed. She did not make a sound. She did not have to. The cookhouse door hit the wall with a sound like a gunshot. Sawyer came through it fast. Not running, but fast. With the particular efficiency of a man who had crossed a room like this before. And he was between her and Callahan before she'd finished processing that the door had opened, one hand on Callahan's chest. Not a shove, but a stop. Absolute and immovable. Let go, Sawyer said. Very quiet, very clear. Callahan's hand dropped from her arm. He stepped back. The rawness in his expression was shifting into something uglier and more defensive. The face of a man who had just gone further than he'd planned and was now calculating what to do about it. Get out, Sawyer said, still quiet. Kane, you don't have any right. Get out of this kitchen. Not loud. Not aggressive in any performed sense, just absolute. Callahan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Alara, and she met that look straight on, which cost her something, but she gave it anyway, because she had learned a long time ago that the moment you looked away was the moment you handed something over. He went out. The door closed behind him. The cookhouse was very quiet. Sawyer turned to look at her. His jaw was tight, the controlled tension of a man holding something in that wanted to go somewhere else. He looked at her arm. She was holding it slightly away from her body, which was an involuntary thing, and she made herself stop it. Are you hurt? He said. No. Alara. I said no. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, and she took a breath. He grabbed my arm, that's all. Sawyer looked at her for a moment. He didn't push it, which she was grateful for. He's going to Griff tonight, Sawyer said. His version of this. We need to go first. I know, she said. Can you? Yes. She straightened. She unclenched her hand from the edge of the work table where it had gone without her noticing. Give me a minute. He waited. He stood by the door and waited without hovering, without the kind of performance of concern that would have made it worse, and she took the minute she'd asked for, which mostly involved standing at the stove with her back to him and breathing until the deep animal panic from the contact faded to something she could put in a box and close. She turned around. All right, she said. They went to find Griff. Griff listened to all of it without changing his expression. He was sitting at the table in the main house with his account books in front of him, and he closed them when they came in, and he listened to Alara first, then Sawyer, and then he was quiet for a long moment. He put his hands on you, Griff said. He grabbed my arm, Alara said again. I want to be exact about what happened. Grabbing someone in my cookhouse is exact enough, Griff said. He stood up. I'll deal with Callahan tonight. He'll be off the property by morning. She hadn't known what she'd expected from Griff exactly. Something more equivocal, maybe. Some version of the speech about winter staffing and replacing a man mid-season. But he was already moving to the door, and his face had the quality of a man who had made a simple decision and was in the process of carrying it out. Griff, Sawyer said. Griff stopped. Callahan's going to say I overstepped, Sawyer said. He's going to say this is about me and her, and not about what he did. Griff looked at him for a moment. I know what he's going to say, he said. I also know what you told me just now, and what she told me just now, and they match each other. He looked at Alara. There are men on this ranch who are going to have trouble with this. Callahan being let go tonight. I need you to understand that. I understand it, she said. It doesn't change my decision. I want you to know that too. He put his hat on. Go get some sleep, both of you. He went out. She and Sawyer stood in the empty main house for a moment. He's a better man than he seems, Sawyer said. He seems like a decent man, she said. He is. A pause. Are you going to be all right? She thought about it honestly, which was something she didn't always do with that question. I don't know yet, she said. Probably yes. Not tonight entirely. He nodded. I'll be around, he said. Simply, without making more of it than it was. She walked back to the cookhouse alone. The cold hit her immediately, and she welcomed it, the sharpness of it, the way it required her attention. She could hear voices from the bunkhouse direction, Griff's among them, flat and final, in the way it got when he was not having a discussion, but ending one. She went inside. She banked the stove. She sat on the edge of the cot in the storeroom and looked at her hands in the dark. Tomorrow, there would be trouble. She knew it the way she knew weather. Not the specific shape of it yet, but the pressure in the air that told you something was building. Callahan would go, and some of the men would have feelings about that, and those feelings would need somewhere to land. She had survived harder things than that. She lay down and pulled the blanket over herself and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see, and thought about Sawyer coming through that door, and thought about what he'd said at the fence line, and thought about Cheyenne and the Carlton and the years between then and now. She had survived harder things, but she was tired tonight of things that required surviving. Callahan was gone by the time the sky began to lighten. She heard him go. Not the specifics, but the sounds of it. A horse being led out of the stable in the dark, the creak of the gate, and then nothing. The bunkhouse stayed quiet for another hour after that. She lay on the cot and listened to the silence and didn't sleep. By the time she had the stove going and the coffee on, the yard was beginning to show the gray-blue of early morning, and she could see from the cookhouse window that his horse was not in the paddock. She stood there for a moment with her cup and looked at the empty space where it had been. Done then. Except it wasn't. The mood in the bunkhouse that morning had a texture she recognized from other situations in other places. The specific tension of a group of people who had collectively experienced something and were now sorting out what they thought about it. Not all of them were going to land in the same place. She'd known that the night before when Griff had said as much, and she'd accepted it, and she still accepted it now, but acceptance was different from not feeling it. Cody came in first, as usual, and he sat down at his end of the bench and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and said nothing for a moment. He really gone? He said finally. Looks that way, Alara said. Cody nodded slowly. He was working through something. She could see it in the way he was looking at the table rather than at her, the way young people looked when they were trying to reconcile two things that didn't easily fit together. He was here 4 years, Cody said. I know. I'm not saying I know what he did. I was sitting right there. He paused. I should have said something sooner, not just that one time. She looked at him. He was 18 years old and had been raised somewhere that had taught him that the right thing and the easy thing were rarely the same, and he was sitting in her cookhouse at 5:30 in the morning carrying the weight of having known that and not acted on it fast enough. You said it when it mattered, she said. Maybe. He didn't seem entirely convinced, but he let it go. He drank his coffee. Dutch is going to be an ass about this for a while. I know. He's not going to say anything directly. He'll just be an ass about it. Yes, I understood you. Cody looked up and something shifted in his face. A reluctant half-smile, there and gone. Right, he said. He helped himself to breakfast when it was ready and ate without another word about it, and she filed away the conversation as something she'd return to later when she had the space for it. Well, Dutch was, as predicted, an ass about it. Not confrontationally, Cody had been right about that much. He came in for breakfast and ate with the deliberate silence of a man registering a formal objection. And when Barker started talking about something unrelated, Dutch answered in monosyllables that were shorter than usual even for Dutch. He didn't look at Alara. He didn't look at Sawyer. Webb came in, ate, left, and said nothing to anyone, which was so consistent with his normal behavior that she couldn't read anything into it. Barker, predictably, had things to say. Callahan's been on this ranch since before I got here, he said, addressing no one specifically, which was his way of addressing everyone. Man's got a temper, but he knows cattle work. He put his hands on someone in my kitchen, Alara said. She kept her voice neutral. That's what happened. I know what happened. Barker looked at her. He wasn't hostile. She'd learned that Barker was almost constitutionally incapable of real hostility, that his currency was talk and information, and that he'd present all sides of a thing with equal energy because that was how his mind worked. I'm just saying it's going to be a long winter with one less hand. Griff made his decision, Sawyer said from the end of the table. He'd been quiet until then. That's the end of it. Barker looked at him for a moment, then at his coffee. Sure, he said. The meal ended. The men went to work. Alara cleaned the kitchen and thought about the shape the day was taking, and whether or not the worst of it was finished. It was not. Well, the thing she hadn't accounted for was Rourke. Rourke was one of the men she'd catalogued as quiet and unproblematic in the early weeks. He'd been there since before her arrival, a compact, weathered man in his late 30s who rode well and worked steadily and kept mostly to himself. He'd been, she now realized, close to Callahan in a way she'd observed but underestimated. Not friends exactly, but the kind of alignment that happened between men who'd been in the same place long enough and had the same general orientation toward the world. She'd filed Rourke as neutral and moved on. She understood her mistake that afternoon. She was outside the cookhouse chopping kindling. The supply had gotten low, and she'd taken to doing it herself because it was faster than waiting for someone to bring it, when Rourke came around the side of the building. He wasn't doing anything specific, just walking, ostensibly, in the direction of the equipment shed. But he slowed when he reached her and stopped in a way that was too deliberate to be incidental. Griff's going to have trouble replacing Callahan, he said. She kept splitting wood. Probably. Good men are hard to find midwinter. I imagine so. A pause. Some men might not re-sign in the spring if the situation here isn't comfortable. She set the axe down and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was careful to stay on the acceptable side of a line. Not threatening, nothing she could point to, but communicating something with complete clarity. Is that something you're planning to tell Griff? She asked. Or something you're telling me? Just an observation. Then I'll observe back that a man who re-signs or doesn't is making a choice about his own situation, she said. That's got nothing to do with me. Rourke looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, and continued on his way to the equipment shed. She picked up the axe and went back to the kindling and told herself that her hands were shaking from the cold. She told Sawyer about it that evening. She hadn't planned to. She'd planned to manage it the way she managed most things. File it, assess it, decide on a response, execute the response without making it anyone else's problem. But he'd come in after supper while she was washing up, and something in his face when he looked at her made the plan change. Rourke talked to me today, she said. Outside. Sawyer stopped. What did he say? She told him, accurately and without embellishment, which was how she told things. Sawyer listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's trying to make you feel responsible for the staffing situation, he said. I know that. It's not the same thing as him actually doing anything. I know that too. She dried the last bowl and set it on the shelf. I just thought you should know, given that you seem to be aware of more things on this ranch than most people. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, something that was almost wry, almost self-deprecating there and gone quickly. Fair, he said. She leaned against the work table. How much longer does the owner stay away? Marcus Weston. His voice had a particular quality when he said the name. She noted it without being entirely sure what it meant. He's due sometime in the next 2 weeks. Barker mentioned it. Barker mentions everything to everyone. He does. A pause. When Weston comes, things are going to get decided. About staffing. About the spring season. About other things. Like whether I stay, she said. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. You think he'll send me away, she said. I don't know what he'll do. Sawyer moved to the stove, refilled his cup from the back burner, stood with it. I know that what's happened in the last few days is going to be part of whatever conversation gets had. Because of Callahan. Because of all of it. She looked at him directly. Are you going to tell me something else I don't know? Because you have a habit of that, and I'd rather know the inventory up front. The almost wry thing came back to his face, and this time it stayed a little longer. Not tonight, he said. That's not nothing. That means there is something. There's always something, he said. Right now what matters is Rourke, and the 2 others who are probably thinking similar things, and what happens when Weston arrives. She held his gaze. He was right that those were the practical concerns, and she had learned to distinguish between a man who redirected because he was hiding something and a man who redirected because he genuinely thought the sequencing mattered. She was not entirely certain which this was, but she let it go for the night. I'm going to bed, she said. Sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She went to the storeroom and lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought about the inventory of things Sawyer Kane had not yet told her, and wondered how heavy it was. The next several days had the quality of a held breath. Rourke kept his distance, civil enough on the surface to give her nothing to bring to grief, hostile enough in the texture of his silences to make every meal slightly worse than it should have been. A man named Holt, who'd arrived 4 days after her and whom she'd barely had occasion to form an opinion about, seemed to be calibrating his behavior to Rourke's, which told her something about the social structure she'd been operating in without fully mapping. Dutch thawed slightly, not toward her specifically, but toward the general situation, in the way that practical men eventually accepted conditions they hadn't chosen because the alternative was to keep expending energy on something that was already done. She caught him taking a second helping of stew on the 4th day and thought that was probably as close to a peace offering as she was going to get from Dutch. Cody, for his part, had made himself useful in the cookhouse with an assiduousness that was clearly guilt-driven, but was also genuinely helpful, and she accepted it gracefully and without making him explain it. Sawyer was around. Not constantly, not intrusively, but present in the way she'd come to understand was characteristic of him, doing the work of the ranch with the same steady efficiency as always, appearing when things needed appearing for, keeping to himself otherwise. The morning fixes to the cookhouse had continued, a new shelf bracket, the front step reinforced again, a gap in the storeroom wall she hadn't mentioned to anyone sealed with packed clay. She started to say something about it one morning and stopped herself. She didn't have words for what she would have said, exactly. Something about the cumulative weight of small attentions. Something about how a person could feel both grateful and unsettled by the same thing. Marcus Weston arrived on a Tuesday. She knew it before she saw him because of the sound, a wagon coming up the main approach at midday when she was preparing the afternoon meal, and the particular shift in the yard's energy that happened when someone with authority arrived somewhere that had been running without that authority for a while. She heard Griff's voice, a different register than usual, and then footsteps on the main house porch. She kept cooking. He came to the cookhouse an hour later. She'd half expected it. The owner would want to assess all parts of the operation, and the kitchen was a part of the operation. But the timing was still slightly startling, the way a thing you've prepared for is still startling when it actually arrives. I was older than she'd expected, late 50s maybe, with the build of a man who had worked hard in his younger years, and now directed the work of other men, but hadn't entirely lost the physical memory of it. His face had the particular quality of someone who had made a great deal of decisions and had developed an efficient relationship with that process. He looked around the cookhouse with the same efficient assessment he probably applied to the rest of the property. "You're the cook," he said. "Elara Voss," she said. "Yes. Griff tells me you've been here just over a month. 5 weeks tomorrow." He looked at the stove, the shelves, the work table, taking inventory. "He also tells me you had a situation with one of the hands." She met his eyes. "Callahan grabbed my arm in this kitchen. Griff made the decision to let him go. I gave Griff an accurate account of what happened." "And Sawyer Kane was involved." "He was present. He separated us." Weston looked at her steadily. He had the manner of a man who'd heard many accounts of many situations and had become competent at sorting the accurate ones from the shaped ones. She kept her posture straight and her face clear and gave him nothing to interpret that wasn't there. "I've had 2 men come to me in the last hour," he said. "Rourke and Holt. They have a version of events that differs from Griff's." "I imagine they do," she said. "Their version suggests this situation has been disruptive, and that your presence here has created—" "I know what their version says," she said. "I'd like you to consider that Callahan was asked, more than once, to behave with basic decency in my kitchen, and that his response was to wait until I was alone and grab me." She kept her voice level. "I'm not responsible for the disruption that followed. I'm responsible for the food on the table, which has been better in the past 5 weeks than it apparently was for the 2 years before I arrived. You can ask any man on this ranch about the food." Weston was quiet for a moment. "I can," he said. He left without another word. She turned back to the stove. Her jaw ached from being held steady, and she hadn't noticed until now. The next morning brought the revelation. She was at the work table before first light, as always, when she heard the main house door and then footsteps crossing the yard toward the cookhouse. 2 sets, Griff's, which she knew by now, and another she didn't immediately recognize. The door opened. Griff came in first, his face carrying the expression of a man in the middle of a situation he hadn't designed and wasn't sure how to narrate. Sawyer was behind him. Sawyer looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the fence line. That careful, measuring quality, but with something else underneath it now, something that looked like a decision finally made. "Elara," Griff said. "There's something—" He stopped, looked at Sawyer. "You should tell her." Sawyer came fully into the cookhouse. He looked at her across the work table, the surface between them covered in flour and the morning's work half done. "Marcus Weston isn't the owner of Black Hollow," he said. She looked at him. "I am," he said. The flour on the work table, the sound of the stove, the smell of the coffee beginning to come up on the back burner. She was aware of all of it with a strange, heightened clarity, while her mind worked through what he'd just said and what it meant and what had preceded it. "You own this ranch," she said. "Yes, and you've been working it as a hand. I work all 3 properties this way." He said it without apology, but also without the performance of someone who expected to be congratulated for it. "I found that men behave differently when they know who's watching. I found I see more this way." "Griff knows," she said. "Griff has always known." Sawyer glanced at Griff briefly. "The men don't, most of them." She looked at Griff. He had the expression of a man who had kept a difficult piece of information for a long time and was relieved to no longer be keeping it. "When you said to come to you if there were problems," she said to him. "I meant it," Griff said. "I run the day-to-day. That hasn't changed." She looked back at Sawyer. She was processing several things at once, and some of them wanted her full attention, and she was not going to give it to them in front of Griff, and she made a decision to deal with the immediate and most practical layer first. "You heard what Rourke and Holt told Weston," she said. "Told you?" "Yes." "And?" "They're wrong," he said, "about what happened, and about what it means." He held her gaze. "I told you the night I arrived what I was going to tell you, but I want to say it plainly now. You earned your place here. You walked in through that gate in a blizzard with nothing, and you worked for 5 weeks without complaint, and you fed this ranch better than it's been fed in years, and you handled things I didn't handle well when they were in front of me, and you're still standing here." A pause. "That's not something I'm sending away." She was silent. "Rourke and Holt," she said. "They can resign or they can go. That's their decision." "And the others? When they find out?" "They'll find out today." He glanced at Griff again. I want to talk to the men at supper, all of them. She looked at him for a long moment. The cookhouse held its warmth around both of them, and outside the sky was beginning to go from black to gray, and somewhere in the stable, a horse was moving and the ranch was waking up the way it woke up every morning, regardless of what was being decided inside this building. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" she said. Not accusatory. She was past that mostly, or at least she could set it aside long enough to ask the question honestly. "The morning you told me about Cheyenne, you could have told me then." He didn't look away. "Because I wanted you to know the first thing first. The apology. The accounting of what I knew and what I did." He paused. "If I told you I owned the ranch in the same breath as telling you I was part of what happened in Cheyenne, you'd have had to figure out two things at once, and I didn't think that was fair." She considered that. It was the kind of reasoning she could follow. It had the shape of genuine consideration rather than calculation, though she was aware the two sometimes looked similar. "You've been thinking about fairness toward me for a while," she said. "Yes," he said, simply. Griff cleared his throat in the particular way of a man who had been standing in someone else's very personal conversation for too long. "I'll be in the barn," he said to Sawyer. He went out. She and Sawyer stood in the cookhouse with the work table between them and the morning coming on outside and the fire going in the stove behind her. "I have questions," she said. "I know you do. More than I can ask right now." "I know that too." He moved his hand slightly, not a gesture exactly, more an acknowledgement of the limitations of the moment. "Supper tonight, then if you want to talk after, I'll be here." "You're always here," she said. A slight edge in it, but not an unfair one. "Yes," he said again, still simple, not defensive. She looked at him for another moment. This man who had fixed her stovepipe and her firebox door and her storeroom wall and her front step and had come through her cookhouse door that night with the decisive certainty of someone who had already decided, a long time ago, that if this specific moment ever arrived, he would not hesitate. This man who had recognized her through a blizzard and kept her secret while trying to give her a fair start, and had been carrying the weight of Cheyenne for years the same way she'd been carrying it, just from a different side. This man who owned the ranch she was standing in and who was looking at her right now like she was the variable in the situation that mattered most. "I need to make breakfast," she said. "I know," he said. He turned to go. "Sawyer." He stopped, turned back slightly. "When you tell the men tonight," she said, "I want to be there." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but recognition, the way a person looked when someone did the thing they'd hoped they might do. "You'll be there," he said. He went out. The door closed, and the morning came fully over Black Hollow Ranch, and Alara Voss turned back to her work table, and her flour and her fire, and began, once again, the work of the day. Her hands were steady. Not because nothing had just happened, but because she had decided to let them be, which was the only kind of steadiness that had ever been real anyway. Outside, the snow on the ground was thinning at the edges where the south-facing walls caught the weakening winter sun. It would be weeks yet before anything truly changed, but the thinning was there, visible, for the first time since she'd arrived. The day passed the way days did when something large was coming, slowly at the front end and then all at once. Alara made breakfast and then the midday meal, and then began supper preparation, and she worked through all of it with the focused efficiency that had carried her through the last 5 weeks, the part of her that knew how to keep moving regardless of what was happening in the rest of her. The men came and ate and went. Griff managed the day's work with the same flat competence as always. Sawyer was out on the property most of the day. She saw him twice from the cookhouse window, once crossing the yard toward the stable, once returning from the east fence line with Webb beside him. He didn't come to the cookhouse until the late afternoon. Rourke and Holt she didn't see until supper. She'd wondered if they'd come. Part of her thought they might simply not, might take supper in the bunkhouse, avoid the cookhouse, give themselves an exit from whatever was about to happen. But they came in with the others, Rourke first, his face carrying the careful blankness of a man who had decided on a posture and was holding it. Holt behind him, younger, less certain in his blankness, the way a younger man was always slightly less certain in his adopted positions. She served the meal. She had made something good. A slow-cooked pork with dried chiles and onion, rice cooked with the last of the smoked stock she'd been saving, a pan of cornbread that had come out right. She had not made it good as a performance. She had made it good because she made things as well as she could, always, and she was not going to stop that for anyone. The men ate. The cookhouse was fuller than usual. Sawyer had said all of them, and all of them had come, which meant 8 men at the table instead of the usual 7 with Callahan's absence. The dynamic was different. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather. Sawyer let the meal get partway through before he stood up. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't ask for attention in any performed way. He just stood, and the table went quiet. The way a table goes quiet when a person with actual authority makes themselves known, and several of the men seemed to register something shifting in the room without yet knowing what it was. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Most of you aren't going to like the way I've handled it. I want to say that up front. I'm not telling you this to make myself look good," he told them. He was direct about it, that he owned the ranch, that he'd been working it alongside them as a hand for the last 8 months, that Griff was, and had always been the operational foreman with full authority, that the arrangement was how he ran all 3 properties. He didn't over-explain or over-justify. He gave them the information the way a man gave information when he respected the people receiving it enough to let them form their own response. The silence that followed had several layers. Cody was staring at Sawyer with the expression of someone who was rapidly recataloguing a month of interactions. Dutch had gone very still in the particular way he went still when something required genuine processing. Barker, remarkably, had nothing to say. His mouth was slightly open, and he was looking at Sawyer with the expression of a man who considered himself well-informed and had just discovered a significant gap in his information. Webb looked unsurprised. She noted that. Rourke's blankness had cracked, not into anything explosive, but into something more genuinely uncertain. The look of a man who had arrived at supper with a strategy and had just found the ground under it gone. "You've been watching us," Holt said. He was young enough that the thing he felt came straight to his face. "The whole time." "I've been working with you," Sawyer said. "I've been doing the same work you've been doing. That wasn't performance. But you knew things we didn't." "I knew who signed my checks," Sawyer said. "That's the main thing." He paused. "I know that's a thing men have feelings about. I'd rather you feel whatever you feel about it than pretend you don't." Rourke looked at him. "And her?" He didn't look at Alara, which was a telling choice. "You knew what was happening, and you—" "I made sure Griff knew," Sawyer said, "and Griff made the right call." His voice was steady. "Callahan put his hands on a woman in this kitchen. You and Holt went to Weston, with a version of events that suggested she'd caused the problem. I want to be clear that I heard what you said, and I want to be equally clear that you were wrong." Rourke's jaw tightened. "I said what I saw. You said what you'd decided." Sawyer looked at him without heat, but without give. "Those are different things, Rue, and you know it." The use of his first name landed differently than a formal address would have. Not softened, more precise, like the difference between a general statement and a specific one. Rourke was quiet. "I'm not asking anyone to feel good about being surprised," Sawyer said, to the table at large. "I'm telling you what's true and what I've decided, and then what happens next is up to each of you." He paused. "Alara Voss stays. She's running this kitchen through the spring season and as long after that as she chooses. That's not a discussion. Anyone who can't work a ranch where that's the situation is free to collect their wages from Griff and go." Nobody moved. "That said," he continued, and something in his voice shifted slightly. Less foreman, more something harder to name, something that was just a man saying what he thought. "I've been on 3 different properties in this territory, and I've watched how the atmosphere of a place gets set. It gets set by the people with the most social weight, and it gets set early, and once it's set, it's hard to move. This ranch has had a problem with how it treats people who are new or different or both. I've watched it for 8 months. I'm done watching it." He looked around the table, not pointedly, not at anyone specific, but at all of them. "What a man earns here is going to be what he earns, not who his friends are, not how long he's been here, not what he looks like or what he is. You do the work right, and you treat people with basic decency, and you've got a place at Black Hollow as long as you want one." He sat down. The cookhouse was quiet long enough to count 10 breaths. Then Dutch, of all people, picked up his fork and went back to his pork and rice. It was such a completely Dutch response to a dramatic moment, the decisive return to the practical, that Cody let out a short, startled sound that was almost a laugh, and that cracked something open in the room that had been too tightly sealed. Barker started talking. About something irrelevant, something about a horse he'd seen traded in Mill Haven, and it was so obviously a bid to return the room to a functioning temperature that she found herself grateful for Barker's particular talent for the first time. Rourke didn't speak for the rest of supper. Holt watched Sawyer for a while, and then watched his food, and then, toward the end, caught Alara's eyes across the room with an expression that was too complicated to read in full, but had something real in it. Not an apology, not yet, but the look of a person realizing they owe one. She gave him a slight nod and moved on. They cleared out in ones and twos. Sawyer stayed as he usually stayed, and she cleaned the table while he sat with his coffee, and neither of them spoke for a while, which had become a mode of communication between them that she trusted more than she'd trusted most conversations. "Rourke's going to go," she said. "He's too proud to stay and accept it." "Probably," Sawyer said. "Holt might stay." "I think so too." She brought her own coffee to the table and sat down across from him, which she hadn't done before. She'd always stood when they talked in the cookhouse, at the stove, or the work table, always with the implied option of turning back to the work. Sitting down was different. He noticed it. She could tell by the way his posture settled slightly, like he'd been holding something and had just been able to put it down. "I want to talk about Cheyenne," she said. He met her eyes. "All right, not about what you did or didn't know. I've thought about that enough." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I want to talk about what it was like. For me. After." He was quiet, listening. "I had $40, she said. "I've told you that. What I haven't told you is that I spent the first week in a boarding room in a town 30 miles outside Cheyenne, and I didn't come out for most of it, not because I was hurt physically, because I'd worked at the Carlton for 2 years, and I'd been good at it, and it had felt like mine. Not the building, not the work, but the feeling of being somewhere that I'd earned. And then it was gone in 3 days with no warning and no recourse, and I didn't know how to be a person in the world again for a while." Sawyer was very still. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel worse than you already do," she said. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand what you're looking at when you look at me. I've been building back from that for 3 years. Every job since then has been provisional. In my own head. Like I was waiting to be told to leave before I let myself actually be there. And here," he said, quiet. She looked at him. "Here I let myself be here faster than I've let myself be anywhere," she said. "I don't entirely know what to do with that." The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night was the particular quiet of a clear Montana winter night, cold and enormous and still. "I was 27 when the Franklin operation ran through," Sawyer said. "I'd been working land contracts for 2 years. I thought I understood the business. I thought the work was clean because the paperwork was clean." He looked at his cup. "I understood maybe a month later what actually happened to the people in the path of it. I'd already moved on to the next contract, and I could have kept moving. Most men did. But you didn't. I kept moving for about another year," he said, "and then I stopped. Bought the Blackfoot property first, small outfit, spent a season actually working it instead of contracting it. Tried to figure out what kind of operation I wanted to run." He paused. "Bought this one 3 years ago. It was in bad shape. Not the land, the culture. Men who'd been here a long time and had decided that the way things were was the way things should be." His jaw moved. "I've been trying to change that slowly enough that it would actually take. You could have just fired people, made a clean start. I could have, but then you've got a ranch of strangers and no memory and no continuity, and half the time the same problems come back because you haven't changed the conditions. You've just changed the faces." He looked at her. "I wanted to change what the place considered normal. That takes longer." She thought about that. It had the ring of something true, something learned from experience rather than theory. It also had the ring of a man who had taken on a project partly because he needed to take on a project, which she understood. "You've been patient," she said. "Sometimes too patient," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Callahan." "Yes." "If I hadn't been here, how long—" "Longer than it should have been," he said. He didn't try to soften it. "I told myself it was managed. It wasn't managed, it was deferred." That honesty was one of the things she'd come to trust about him, the willingness to say the plain version of a thing rather than the version that reflected better on himself. It wasn't a common trait. She'd encountered it rarely enough that she'd started to value it specifically. "I'm not going to tell you that makes everything even," she said. "I'm not asking it to." But I think you're different from the man who signed Franklin contracts, she said. I think that person made decisions and then spent years figuring out what they cost. And I think that changes a person if they let it. He was quiet for a moment. Are you saying you forgive me? Because you don't have to. I'm saying I understand the difference between a man who did something wrong and a man who is wrong, she said. Those aren't the same. I've spent enough time punishing myself for the former by acting like I was the latter. She paused. I'm tired of that for myself. It seems like a waste to keep doing it to other people. Something in his face shifted. The particular shift of a person receiving something they'd been trying not to need. It was gone quickly, the way genuine things were quick in people who had practiced not showing them. But she'd seen it. You said the choice was mine, she said. He looked up. Last night, when you told the men, you said I stay as long as I choose. I want to talk about what choosing looks like. Tell me, he said. She set her cup down. She'd been thinking about this for the better part of the day, between the soup and the cornbread and the long afternoon of preparation, the way she thought through things best, with her hands occupied and her mind loose. I want a proper kitchen, she said, not just functional, a kitchen that can actually produce what I know how to produce. The oven needs a real repair, not a patch. I need consistent supply runs, not whatever gets negotiated each time. And I want to be the one placing the supply orders, not requesting and waiting, placing. He nodded slowly. That's fair. I want a wage that reflects what I'm actually doing, she said, not what a cook at a ranch that's getting by earns. What a cook who's been running this operation earns. Also fair. And I want... She stopped for a moment, started again. I want to be consulted when decisions are made that affect how this kitchen runs. Not in every conversation, not at every meeting, but if something's changing that changes what I can do, I want to be part of that conversation. He looked at her for a long moment. That's what you want. That's the start of what I want, she said. I reserve the right to add to it. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a full smile she'd seen from him. A slight upward shift on one side, a quality of warmth that he didn't usually let into his face in any visible way. Noted, he said. And I want to know when things are happening on this ranch that affect me, she said. No more sitting on information because you've decided the timing isn't right. You tell me. Agreed, he said. No hesitation. She nodded. Then I'll stay. It arrived simply, the way the right decisions arrived. Without fanfare, without the sense that she was crossing some momentous threshold. Just the plain landing of a thing that had been building toward itself for 5 weeks. She would stay. She had earned this place and she would stay in it, and she would build something real inside it, the way you built anything real. Slowly, without certainty, with a great deal of work and some amount of hope, you were careful not to name too loudly. He looked at her across the table. I'm glad, he said. 2 words, plain, meaning exactly what they said and nothing performed about them. She picked up her cup again. I'm going to need help with the oven repair, she said. Not from you, from someone who actually knows what they're doing with iron. There's a man in Mill Haven, he said. Blacksmith. He's done work on the stable fixtures. I'll send word. Good. They stayed at the table a while longer, the fire burning lower in the stove and the night fully settled around the ranch. And they talked about practical things. The spring hiring, the supply routes, whether the east fence was going to need a full replacement before the thaw, or whether the current repairs would hold. Normal things. Ranch things. The kind of conversation 2 people had when they were building something together and the building had moved past its uncertain stage into something with actual shape. She noticed that it felt easy. Not simple. There were things between them that were not simple and would probably never be entirely simple, but easy in the way that things felt when they were in the right place, when the fit was right. She filed that away with some care. Rourke left 2 days later. He collected his wages from Griff on a Thursday morning and rode out without ceremony, which she respected in its way. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't come to the cookhouse. He just went, and the ranch adjusted around his absence the way it had adjusted around Callahan's, with the specific resilience of operations that have learned how to keep going. Holt stayed. He came to the cookhouse the morning after Rourke left, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, in the way that young men stood when they were attempting to say something they didn't have practice saying. I wasn't fair, he said. What I said to Weston. I knew it wasn't the whole picture. She looked at him. He was maybe 22, with the face of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide what he felt, which meant she could see the discomfort of the admission sitting plainly on him. "You're telling me now," she said. "I should have told it right the first time." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She let it sit there without softening it, because she thought he needed to hear it plainly, and because she'd learned that the people who benefited most from truth were the ones you trusted enough to give it to. "But you're here. That counts for something." He nodded. Still uncomfortable, but with something lighter underneath it now. "That pork from supper the other night," he said. "Is there any left?" "For breakfast? I'm hungry." She almost laughed. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She fed him. He became, in the weeks that followed, one of the more reliable people in her cookhouse. Not demonstrative about it, not making a show of making amends, just present and decent and willing. People surprised you. She had forgotten, in the years of managing and being careful, that people surprised you. March arrived and the snow began its real withdrawal. Not all at once. Winter in Montana released its grip. The way stubborn things release things, slowly and with backsliding. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. A week of melt, and then a late storm that put 6 inches back down over everything that had been tentatively emerging. But the direction was clear. The light was different. The air had a quality in the mornings that was less about surviving and more about what came next. The garden plot behind the cookhouse began to show at the edges where the south wall shed its snow melt. She walked out one morning with her coffee and looked at it. The frozen ground beginning to soften at the surface. The dead stalks of last year's plants still standing in their rows. The whole thing waiting. She thought about what she could put in. Onions, certainly. Potatoes. Some herbs. She'd seen sage and thyme in the old tin, and they'd likely self-seeded if she was lucky. She thought about what the kitchen could become if the garden produced through the summer. What she could do with fresh rather than dried, with abundance rather than rationing. She hadn't thought about summer yet. Not specifically, not as a thing she was going to be present for. She thought about it now. Sawyer found her there. He came around the corner of the cookhouse the way he came most places, without announcing himself, present before you'd quite expected him. He stood beside her and looked at the garden plot with his coffee cup and said nothing for a moment. "It was a kitchen garden," he said finally. "A woman named Clara ran this kitchen, must be 6 years ago. She put it in herself. Nobody kept it up after she left." "Why did she leave?" "Got married, moved to Idaho." A pause. "She was a good cook. Not as good as you." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the garden, not at her. "You're allowed to say things like that more often," she said. "I'll work on it." She turned back to the garden. The ground was soft enough at the edges that she could almost press her boot into it. A few weeks and she could turn it. A few weeks after that, she could plant. "I'm going to need seed orders," she said, "before the supply run. I'll see to it. And I want to put in a cold frame this year, against the south wall. Extends the growing season by 6 weeks. I can build it." "I know you can," she said, "but let me tell you where I want it first." He looked at her then. And there it was again. That almost smile, the warmth he kept mostly internal, the quality of a person who was, underneath the layers of practice and patience, and the weight of things he'd done wrong and tried to make right, glad to be where he was. She looked back at the garden. She thought about the woman she'd been 5 weeks ago, standing in the dark on the road outside Mill Haven in a borrowed coat, watching a wagon drive away, calculating whether she could make it 4 miles in a blizzard on the strength of having nowhere else to go. That woman had been so focused on the next hour, the next meal, the next place to sleep, that she had stopped thinking about what anything was for. Survival had become its own logic, self-sustaining and sealed. She thought about the Carlton, the kitchen she'd loved, the 2 years that had felt like hers before they weren't. She'd been trying to get back to something like that ever since. And she'd been choosing places that were never quite right, or leaving before they could become wrong, which amounted to the same thing. She was not the same person who had stood on that road. She was not the same person who had left the Carlton with $40 and a bag of clothes. Those things had happened to her, and they were real, and they had cost her, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But they were also behind her in a way they had not been before, and that was a distinction that mattered. She had stopped waiting to be asked to leave. That was the thing, she realized. The whole of it, really. She had spent 3 years waiting for the moment when things went wrong because things had gone wrong before, and the waiting had become a way of not being entirely anywhere, a way of keeping herself ready to move so that the moving, when it came, wouldn't surprise her. And the cost of that was that she had never fully arrived anywhere, because arriving somewhere meant staying long enough to be hurt by losing it. She was staying. She was going to plant a garden and fix an oven and learn the names of the hills she could see from the cookhouse window, and remember which floorboard in the storeroom creaked and make food that these specific people, with their specific hungers and preferences and flaws, needed. She was going to be somewhere. That was not a small thing. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it before. It was, in fact, the whole thing. The spring hiring brought 4 new men to Black Hollow, all of whom arrived to a cookhouse that was warm, and a first meal that was better than they'd expected, and a woman who ran the kitchen with a competence so evident it left nothing to argue with. One of them tried, a man named Sellers, who lasted 3 days before Webb took him aside and said something she wasn't privy to, but which resulted in Sellers thereafter treating her with the specific awkward respect of someone who has been told, plainly, that they are wrong, and has not yet finished digesting it. Cody, by that point, had become the informal interpreter of the kitchen's customs for new arrivals. He did it without being asked, and with the slightly proprietary air of someone who had decided, somewhere in the last 2 months, that this was a place he belonged, and that he had a stake in how it ran. She found this both touching and occasionally maddening, which was probably how people felt about most things that mattered to them. Dutch brought her a plant. It was a small, bedraggled thing in a clay pot. She didn't know what it was, and he didn't explain. And he set it on the cookhouse windowsill one morning and walked out again. She kept it there and watered it, and it eventually produced small yellow flowers that had no culinary value whatsoever, but that she tended regardless, because some things were about what they meant and not what they were useful for. Griff told her, one afternoon in early April, that this was the best winter the ranch had eaten through in his memory. He said it the way he said things, plainly, without setup, as a statement of fact. She thanked him the same way, and they stood in the yard in the thin spring sunshine for a moment, with nothing more to say, which was its own kind of conversation. She and Sawyer were not simple. She had not expected them to be. He had carried the weight of what he'd been part of in Cheyenne for long enough that setting it down was not an instantaneous process, and she understood that. She understood the way guilt became structural if you held it long enough, how it organized a person, how they sometimes didn't know who they were without it. She watched him working on it in the specific way that people who were working on something worked on it, unevenly, with setbacks, and with the kind of determination that didn't announce itself. She was not uncomplicated either. She had years of provisional thinking to unlearn. She caught herself, regularly, pre-building the explanation she'd give when she was asked to leave, the plan she'd execute, the door she'd go through. She was learning to notice when she was doing it. That was the first step, the noticing. They were honest with each other. That was the real thing, the foundation of whatever was being built. He told her when decisions were being made that affected her. She told him when something wasn't working and what she thought should change. They disagreed sometimes, about the supply budget, about how to handle a situation with a new hand, about whether the cold frame should be against the south wall or the east one. She won that one. The east wall got more morning sun, and that was the end of it. The disagreements were real, and neither of them performed reasonableness they didn't feel, and they came through the other side of each one with something slightly more solid than what they'd had before. One evening in late April, she was sitting on the step outside the cookhouse after supper, watching the last of the light go out of the sky. The air was warm enough, finally, to sit outside without a coat. The first real warmth of spring, tentative and easy in the way of things that had been earned. Sawyer came and sat beside her on the step, not beside her the way he'd sat near her in the cookhouse, across a work table or at the opposite end of the table. Beside her. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. Neither of them said anything for a while. "The onions came up," she said. "I saw. The thyme didn't make it through, but I found sage. The sage always makes it," he said. Clara said the same thing. Some things just decide they're going to survive and nothing stops them. She thought about that. About the things that decided to survive. About the particular stubbornness of growing things that had no apparent reason to keep going and went anyway. "Sawyer," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad I walked through that gate." He was quiet for a moment. She felt the slight shift in him, the settling, the way he settled when he was going to say something real. "So am I," he said. "More than you know." The last light left the sky, and the first stars came out over Montana, cold and clear and impossibly far away, and Black Hollow Ranch held itself in the warm dark, like something that had come through a difficult season and was still standing, not perfect, not without its damage and its history and its unresolved complications, but standing and inhabited by people who had decided, each in their own way, to stop running from the things they'd built and start trusting them. Elara Voss sat on the step of her cookhouse, the one she'd earned, the one with the fixed oven and the mended walls and the garden coming up out back, and felt for the first time in 3 years the uncomplicated weight of being somewhere that was hers, not because it had been given to her, not because she'd survived to it, because she'd stayed long enough to deserve it. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. Not where you ended up, but what you'd been willing to build to get there, and whether you'd had the courage to believe the building would hold. She had been willing. The building held. For now, that was enough. For now, it was everything.